21 Billboard Top 40 hits, 3 #1 singles between 1969 and 1975. Three Dog Night sold tens of millions of records worldwide, more hits than almost any American band of their era. For a brief period in the early 1970s, they were the highest-earning touring band in the world, surpassing even the Rolling Stones in annual revenue. Joy to the World became the best-selling single of 1971. Three Dog Night wasn't just successful. They were unstoppable. Then it all collapsed. One lead singer fired for heroin addiction. Unable to complete performances. Legal battles over the band's name that would drag on for decades. Three competing egos destroying themselves from the inside. Members touring under rival versions of the same band, each claiming to be the real Three Dog Night. The music industry shifted overnight, and the band that had defined early 1970s radio became irrelevant. Critics called their later work derivative. Fans called it betrayal. Chuck Negrin stood on stage, so high he couldn't remember the lyrics to songs he'd sung 1,000 times. Danny Hutton and Corey Wells watched their third crumble in real time, powerless to stop the addiction or save the band. Money poured in from sold-out arenas, then vanished into cocaine, heroin, and legal fees. Years of lawsuits, broken contracts, and trademark disputes that meant the band's name belonged to lawyers more than musicians. A decade of infighting, rehab attempts, and failed comebacks. This is the story of how success became poison. How three voices that created one of the biggest sounds in American pop music became three men who couldn't stand to be in the same room. How the highest-earning band in rock watched their empire fracture over addiction, ego, and what Three Dog Night even meant. But to understand the collapse, we have to go back to 1968 to Los Angeles, where none of this seemed remotely possible. Los Angeles, 1968. The music scene wasn't about authenticity here. It was about packaging, production, and finding the next big sound. This was a studio town, a place where session musicians made more money than touring bands, where producers held more power than artists. The Sunset Strip clubs were packed, but stardom mattered more than craft. That's where Three Dog Night were born. The band didn't start as a band at all. Danny Hutton, Corey Wells, and Chuck Negrin were session singers, solo performers working the LA club circuit separately through the mid-1960s. They weren't innovators. They weren't songwriters. They were interpreters, voices for hire with range and power. In 1968, Hutton had an idea that seemed ridiculous. Three lead singers, not backup vocalists or harmonizers, but three rotating frontmen, each with a distinct voice, sharing the spotlight equally. Add a tight backing band, Michael Alsop on guitar, Jimmy Greenspoon on keyboards, Joe Shermy on bass, Floyd Sneed on drums, and you had something the industry had never seen before. The name came from an Australian Aboriginal expression. Three Dog Night meant it was so cold you needed three dogs sleeping beside you for warmth. It was strange, memorable, and meant absolutely nothing to American audiences. Perfect. Their approach was unprecedented. They wouldn't write their own material. Instead, they'd become the greatest interpreters of other people's songs, transforming obscure songwriter demos into radio hits. Harry Nilsson, Randy Newman, Hoyt Axton, Paul Williams, these were the architects. Three Dog Night would be the builders. Their first break came in 1969 when one, written by Harry Nilsson, hit number 5 on the Billboard Hot 100. Nilsson's original version was obscure, melancholic, barely noticed. Three Dog Night's version was powerful, emotional, and impossible to ignore. Radio stations played it constantly. Audiences connected to the vulnerability in the harmonies, the raw emotion in Chuck Negrin's lead vocal. But even in the beginning, The seeds of destruction were already there. 3 frontmen meant 3 egos. 3 voices meant competition over who's saying lead on which track. 3 personalities meant management walking a tightrope, trying to keep everyone satisfied while the machine kept accelerating. Hutton was calculated, business-minded. Wells was the showman, charismatic and hungry for attention. Negron had the voice, the power, the ability to make audiences cry with a single note. But Negron also had demons. Addiction ran in his family. He'd struggled with substances before the band even formed. They just didn't know it yet. By 1969, the lineup was locked. Danny Hutton, Corey Wells, Chuck Negron on rotating lead vocals, Michael Alsop, Jimmy Greenspoon, Joe Shermy, Floyd Sneed holding down the musical foundation. This was the configuration that would dominate American radio for the next 5 years. Their sound was unlike anything on the charts. Polished vocal harmonies overdriving rock instrumentation. Emotional ballads that crossed pop, rock, soul, and soft rock audiences. They didn't fit neatly into any category, which meant they appealed to everyone. Teenagers bought their records. Adults didn't change the station. Radio programmers loved them because Three Dog Night was safe, but not boring. Mama Told Me Not. To come in 1970 hit #1. Randy Newman's original was quirky, strange, almost satirical. Three Dog Night made it a party anthem, capturing generational fear of excess wrapped in an infectious groove. It spent weeks at the top of the charts. Critics called them derivative, manufactured. Fans called them brilliant. 1971, Joy to the World, written by Hoyt Axton. A song about a bullfrog that became one of the biggest singles in pop history. It spent 6 weeks at #1. It sold millions of copies. It became the best-selling single of 1971, played at weddings, graduations, sporting events. Three Dog Night had created a cultural moment. The album naturally in 1970 delivered multiple top 10 hits. They weren't just successful, they were ubiquitous. Turn on any radio station, coast to coast, and within 20 minutes you'd hear Three Dog Night. They filled arenas, they headlined festivals. For a brief period in the early 1970s, they were the highest-earning touring band in the world, pulling in more annual revenue than the Rolling Stones. 1972, Black and White hit #1. A civil rights anthem that proved Three Dog Night could carry social messages without losing mass appeal. They made songs about racial unity sound effortless, mainstream, acceptable to middle America. But beneath this triumph, something dark was growing. Chuck Negron's drug use escalated. What started as recreational cocaine became a daily necessity. Then heroin entered the picture. He later admitted that during the band's peak, he was using heavily, hiding it from bandmates, management, audiences. The touring schedule was relentless, over 100 shows a year. Different city every night. No time to rest, no time to heal. Drugs became survival, then addiction, then prison. Danny Hutton and Corey Wells resented the attention Negron received. He had the voice everyone remembered. He sang lead on the biggest hits. Interviews focused on him. Fans screamed his name. The Democratic three-singer concept became a hierarchy, and Hutton and Wells felt invisible. Management encouraged competition. Keep them fighting for the spotlight. Keep them hungry. It worked commercially. It destroyed them personally. Behind the scenes, everything was falling apart, and the machine kept rolling faster than any of them could control. 1973. This was it, the apex. 7 million albums sold in the United States alone. 21 top 40 hits over 5 years. 3 #1 singles. Constant radio rotation across every format. Three Dog Night had become the sound of early 1970s America. They were on television, in movies, on every playlist. They matched the Beatles' chart dominance from earlier in the decade. They were untouchable. But what fans didn't see was the lifestyle destroying them from the inside. The touring was brutal. 200 shows a year meant flying between cities daily, sleeping in hotels, living on buses, performing every night regardless of health or mental state. Danny Hutton tried to manage the business side while performing. Corey Wells pushed through exhaustion with charisma and stage presence. Chuck Negron used heroin to cope, then needed heroin to function, then couldn't function even with heroin. Studio sessions became tense. Who sings lead? Who gets the spotlight? Who gets credit? Management rotated vocalists strategically, but the resentment built. Hutton felt he wasn't getting enough leads on the biggest songs. Wells wanted more recognition. Negron, despite his addiction, remained the voice audiences connected with most powerfully. And that's where the trouble began. By 1974, the music industry shifted. Disco emerged. Glam rock exploded. Punk was forming in underground clubs. The polished, vocal harmony sound that Three Dog Night perfected suddenly felt dated, safe, irrelevant. Radio stations still played their hits, but new releases didn't chart as high. The band tried to adapt. They chased contemporary sounds. They worked with different producers. But Three Dog Night's strength was interpreting great songs with powerful harmonies. When they tried to be something else, they lost what made them special. Chuck Negron's addiction reached crisis levels. He showed up late to recording sessions. He forgot lyrics on stage. He nodded off during interviews. Bandmates tried interventions. Management threatened consequences. Nothing worked. Heroin had him completely. In 1975, Danny Hutton and Corey Wells made the devastating decision. Chuck Negron, the voice whose lead vocals had defined their biggest hits, whose emotional delivery had made One and Joy to the World iconic, was fired from Three Dog Night. He was just 30 years old when he was removed from the band at the height of their cultural impact. New releases went nowhere. Chart positions dropped from top 10 to top 40 to not charting at all. Radio stations moved on. Disco dominated the airwaves. Punk exploded in clubs. The audience that had made Three Dog Night the biggest band in America disappeared almost overnight. Then, in late 1976, it officially ended. No dramatic announcement, no farewell tour, just silence. The band that had sold tens of millions of records, that had 3 #1 singles, that had been the highest-earning touring act in the world, couldn't fill mid-size theaters anymore. Danny Hutton and Corey Wells went their separate ways. Chuck Negron spiraled deeper into addiction. The other band members, Michael Alsop, Jimmy Greenspoon, Joe Shermy, Floyd Sneed, scattered into session work, side projects, obscurity. But the story didn't end. Because the fight's over what Three Dog Night meant, who owned the name, who deserved the royalties, those battles were just beginning. Chuck Negron spent the next decade battling heroin addiction. He lost everything: money, career, relationships, dignity. He later described the late 1970s and early 1980s as a nightmare, stealing to support his habit, overdosing multiple times, narrowly escaping death repeatedly. Meanwhile, Danny Hutton and Corey Wells began exploring reunion possibilities, but not with Chuck. Never with Chuck. The resentment, the betrayal, the years of watching him destroy the band made reconciliation impossible. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, competing versions of Three Dog Night toured. Some included Hutton. Some included Wells. None included Negron. Legal disputes over the band's name created chaos. Who had the right to call themselves Three Dog Night? Courts ruled. Settlements were reached. The confusion never fully resolved. The Lowest moment came when multiple Three Dog Night lineups toured simultaneously, each claiming authenticity, none containing more than one or two original members. Fans didn't know which show to attend. Promoters booked the wrong band. The name that had once meant guaranteed sold-out arenas became a legal problem, a trademark dispute, a punchline. Chuck Negron finally got sober in the late 1980s. He began touring as a solo artist, billed as Chuck Negron, voice of Three Dog Night. He wrote a memoir, Three Dog Nightmare, detailing his addiction and the band's dysfunction. It became a bestseller. Critics praised his honesty. Former bandmates felt betrayed by the revelations. The resentment never healed. Danny Hutton continued touring under the official Three Dog Night name with replacement members. Corey Wells joined. Periodically until his death in 2015, Chuck Negron remained excluded, performing his versions of the hits to smaller audiences, forever marked as the addict who destroyed the band's second act. By the 2000s, Death claimed more original members. Joe Shermy in 2002, Jimmy Greenspoon in 2015, Corey Wells in 2015, the few remaining originals. Danny Hutton and Chuck Negron continue performing separately, each claiming the true legacy of Three Dog Night, neither willing to reconcile. The band that had defined early 1970s American pop music couldn't survive its own success. By 1976, Three Dog Night quietly went on indefinite hiatus. No official breakup, no farewell tour, just silence. Where they went next tells you everything about what Three Dog Night had become. Danny Hutton became the keeper of the name. He maintained the trademark, assembled touring lineups with replacement musicians, kept the Three Dog Night brand alive through casinos, oldies festivals, corporate events. He found moderate success, enough to sustain a career, but far from the arena-filling dominance of the early 1970s. He stayed businesslike, calculated, protecting what remained of the legacy. Corey Wells joined Hutton periodically for reunion tours. He maintained the showmanship, the stage presence, but the hits were decades old. He performed the catalog until his death in 2015, never escaping the shadow of what Three Dog Night had been during their peak. Chuck Negron, the man whose voice had defined their biggest hits, became a cautionary tale. After years of addiction, overdoses, and personal destruction, he got sober in the late 1980s. He began touring as Chuck Negron, voice of Three Dog Night, performing the songs he'd made famous to smaller crowds. He championed addiction recovery, spoke at schools and treatment centers, wrote his memoir. He stayed true to the emotional power that made Three Dog Night special, but remained bitter. Bitter that Hutton got the name. Bitter that Wells got the reunions. Bitter that Three Dog Night had become a nostalgia act controlled by the members who hadn't sung the leads on the biggest hits. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from rock history. Michael Alsop, Jimmy Greenspoon, Joe Shermy, and Floyd Sneed drifted into various projects. Some session work, some touring with other acts. None found success approaching Three Dog Night's peak. Shermy passed away in 2002. Greenspoon and Wells both died in 2015. Within months of each other. And for decades, Three Dog Night was dead. But the story wasn't over. Rock and Roll Hall of Fame discussions emerged periodically. Should Three Dog Night be inducted? They had the chart success, the sales, the cultural impact. But they didn't write their hits. They weren't innovators. They were interpreters. The debates raged. The band was never inducted. Legal battles over. Royalties continued. Who owned the rights to recordings made in the early 1970s? How should streaming revenue be divided? Chuck Negron filed complaints claiming unfair compensation. Court rulings generally favored the band's corporate structure. The emotional fractures remained irreversible. Reunion attempts happened sporadically. Danny Hutton's touring version of Three Dog Night continued with hired musicians. But without Chuck Negron's voice, without the chemistry of the original three frontmen, it felt hollow. Fans attended for nostalgia. Critics dismissed it as a cover band. The real war wasn't just about who showed up. It was about legacy. Decades later, the battle became about what Three Dog Night meant. Was it the democratic three-singer concept that revolutionized vocal groups? Was it the interpreter model that proved bands didn't need to write hits to define an era? Was it the commercial machine that generated 21 top 40 hits in 6 years? Or was it all of them and none of them at the same time? Today, Three Dog Night exists only as a catalog and competing touring acts. Danny Hutton, now in his 80s, continues performing under the Three Dog Night name with replacement members. Chuck Negron, also in his 80s, tours separately as the voice of Three Dog Night. Still excluded from the official band, Corey Wells is gone. Most of the original lineup is gone. They sold tens of millions of records. They achieved 21 top 40 hits. They topped charts across multiple years. They pioneered the three-vocalist concept, then watched it destroy them from the inside. They proved that bands didn't need to write songs to dominate radio, then learned that interpreter success couldn't survive changing musical trends. But success created legends and enemies. Millions of dollars earned, millions of records sold. Here's as the highest-earning touring band in the world, and still, decades later, they're at war over what any of it meant. Three Dog Night proved that you can achieve 21 top 40 hits, 3 #1 singles, dominate American radio for years, and still lose everything that mattered. They became the biggest band in the world by perfecting other people's songs, by creating a vocal machine so powerful it didn't need creativity, only execution. And when the music industry shifted, when disco replaced rock, when audiences wanted innovation instead of interpretation, all that was left was bitterness, legal battles, and 3 men who couldn't agree on what they built or who deserved credit for building it. The commercial success hid the creative compromise. The touring revenue hid the addiction. The radio dominance hid the resentment building behind the harmonies. And now, decades later, the only thing Three Dog Night can agree on is that they'll never agree. There are no reunions left, no reconciliations coming. Just 3 brilliant vocalists who created something extraordinary and spent the rest of their lives watching it crumble over ego, addiction, and legal disputes. The music survived. The band didn't. What part of this story hits you the hardest? Was it Chuck Negron's firing at the height of their success? The legal battles that turned bandmates into enemies? Or the fact that the highest-earning touring band in the world couldn't survive their own formula? Did you see Three Dog Night live early 1970s peak era? Or the later reunion tours with replacement members? Drop your memories and opinions below. And if this story fascinated you, hit like and subscribe, because the rise and fall of legends never gets old. Rock history is full of bands that conquered the world and then destroyed themselves. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.